Hi everybody, good morning. Welcome to the 83rd Learn with Lorna. I'll just wait a second before we get started. Hi Tanya. Always like seeing who can say hello first, other than me obviously. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. I am Lorna and I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service, as some of you will know, has 4 archive centres across the Highlands. We have the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, we have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Skye and Lochailse Archive Centre in Portree, and Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, together making up the service. Thank you. Yes, I am feeling a lot better, thank you. Still got a headache, still tired, but much on the mend, thank you. This series, as you'll know if you've watched before, is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that, and thank you to those of you who've done so. It really does make a difference to us. This week is the final in our food and drink theme before we move on to November's theme, which is crime and punishment, which is going to be fab. I've spoken numerous times over the past 82 episodes about the importance of herring and the herring industry to the north of Scotland, especially to the Sutherland and Caithness coast, out to Wick and so on. But I haven't yet looked at one of the other fish that's really strongly associated with Scotland, salmon, and so that is the reason for this week's subject. And I'll start with a brief overview of what salmon are, why they're of such importance to Scotland, and then move on to look at some of the different records we have relating to this. It turned into a really exciting little project to research, so we'll see that as we go on. You'll see why I'm quite fired up about this one. I know very, very little about fishing, which my mum's mum, my nanny, would be most offended about. She was a very passionate fisher. But I do know a lot about crime fiction, which will turn out to be very relevant as we go through this week's unexpectedly. Okay, so let's start with a brief overview of salmon, what they are and why they're of importance to Scotland. Well, I thought I would just read you an extract from the Nature Scotland Nature Scot website, which is Scotland's nature agency, and just give the official definition rather than me trying to paraphrase it. Atlantic salmon are found in the temperate and Arctic regions of the Northern Hemisphere. They occur in the rivers of the countries that border both sides of the North Atlantic Ocean and the Baltic Sea. As an anadromous species, Atlantic salmon live in freshwater as juveniles but migrate to sea as adults before returning upriver to spawn. Atlantic salmon return to their native river and even to the same stretch of the river from which they are born with amazing accuracy. This means that many populations of Atlantic salmon may exist within the same river. Spawning usually occurs from November to December but may extend from October to February in some areas, particularly larger rivers. About 90 to 95% of all Atlantic salmon die after spawning has taken place, but those that survive may spawn again. And one of the key things you'll know there, if you know anything at all about the subject, is that ability of salmon to go out to sea and then find their way back to the place that they were spawned. And that's why we see the salmon leaping up the rivers and so on to get back to those grounds. And as they develop, they go through various stages, and each stage has a different name. So when the eggs hatch, they're known as, I think, alvins. Again, if anyone is a fisher, please do correct my pronunciation. And then when they're about 3 centimetres long, they emerge from the gravel that they were incubated in, and at that stage are known as fry, and that's why we say small fry to mean something little and young. They go on to develop the distinctive markings of a salmon, and at that point they become known as parr. And they live in the river for several years until they're around 12 centimetres, when their bodies undergo an extraordinary change that allows them to move from freshwater to seawater. And at that point they turn silver and they're known as smolts. They head out to sea then in about April, May, June, somewhere around there. And they stay at sea for anything from 1 year to 2 to 3 years. They can stay for several years before returning up the river to spawn. And as I say, that's when you see that very dramatic salmon leap, either in a natural form in a river or in the salmon ladders that have been constructed specifically for the purpose. So that very loosely is the life cycle of a salmon in the wild, and of course there are variations, there are different species, and that will alter according to where you are. They can grow up to over 1 metre in length, which I did not know, and they can weigh up to 6 stone, which is quite extraordinary. And as I say, they're vital to the Scottish economy. Scottish fishing, salmon fishing and salmon farming is worth over £1 billion to the Scottish economy, and they've always been important, and we can see that from the first statistical account of the parish of Thurso, which was written in 1798, and it reads like this. Salmon fishing. There are 6 rivers in Caithness where salmon is caught: Thurso, Berrydale, Langwall, Wick, Force and Dunbeath. The 3 first of these are the exclusive property of Sir John Sinclair, Baronet, but the river Thurso is of greater value than all the rest, and rents for £300 per annum. It has frequently produced from 150 to 200 barrels of salmon in a season, and it is a fact well attested that in the year 1736, 2,560 salmon were taken in the course of a day upon one pool in the river of Thurso. The salmon fishing in Thurso commences in November and ends in August. For many years past, the greater part of the fish taken in this river, which are allowed to be of the best quality, have been boiled and kitted and carried on board smacks to London, where they sell for a high price. So he's describing how many are caught, how many are sent, the fact that they're packed into barrels and can be sent away to the foreign markets as well. There are, he says, about 250 barrels of salmon shipped annually at Thurso. Interesting to note that he's obviously saying that catch of 2,560 salmon that was caught in 1736 was so unusual that as an appendix to the statistical account, he's added in a bit of proof about this number. So he says, appendix to the above, on the celebrated draught of salmon in the river Thurso. In the preceding statistical account, chapter 2, section 1, mention was made of the celebrated draught of salmon caught in the river of Thurso, when no less a number than 2,560 were caught. That circumstance has often been mentioned, but seemed incredible to many who were not acquainted with the circumstances attending that event. With a view of having the facts ascertained, the following certificate was given by 3 persons who witnessed the transaction and are of unquestioned veracity. And so there's a statement there, signed by George Patterson, who was a baillie of Thurso, George Swanson, who was a shoemaker, and Donald Finlayson, a fisher. They certify and declare that on the 23rd day of July, Old Style, so the old year, around the year mentioned, they were caught at one haul on the pool, on the Crewe pool above the water of the town of Thurso, 2,560 salmon. These fish were caught by a large net, beginning the sweep at the creeps and coming down the stream to a stem at the low end of the pool. The net was carried by 18 to 20 men with long poles in their hands, keeping down the ground rope, and the fish were afterwards taken ashore by degrees in a smaller net. Every man got a fish and some whisky for his trouble. We certify and declare that we were personally present when these fish were caught. So taking the time to certify, that's quite interesting. So that's from the statistical accounts, which, as I've mentioned before, are available online. But what do we have in our own collections specifically about salmon? Well, it turns out all sorts of things, and all sorts of really interesting things. So we have records relating to individuals' experiences of fishing for pleasure. We have records relating to the management of fishing rights, both from a local government perspective, so for instance in the boroughs, and also on the estates. We have a huge amount of material relating to people who flouted the rules and got caught. And we have records relating to fishing, salmon fishing and salmon farming as businesses. We also have plans and drawings showing those iconic salmon leaps, salmon ladders. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the documents that talk about the admin and legalities of fishing on an estate. We have references to this within all our big estate collections, and it's really clear how important it was. So for instance, in our Munro of Fowls collection, which is an extensive collection of charters and sayseens and other legal documents dating from the 1200s onwards, there are around 80 references specifically relating to salmon fishing in those legal charters, explicitly, very clearly explaining who has rights over what stretch of water, and it's very clearly delineated. So for instance, this document, this is a document from 1580 from the Munro of Fowls collection, and it's a Letters of Reversion by David Clappin, indweller in Leith, so not Highland, so just near Edinburgh, concerning salmon fishing in Invershin, 11th of July 1580. And it says that David Clappin is narrating that although Robert Munro of Fowls, with consent of Robert Munro, his son and apparent heir, has sold to the said David Clappin the 3 cobbles salmon fishing of Calmachalmach, and cobbles salmon fishing on the inner and outer waters of the Invershin, with part of the salmon fishing on the water of Invershin and part of the salmon fishing on the S, together with the salmon fishing in the year of Kilturn. Nevertheless, so he's been given this right by the Munros of Fowls, he says, nevertheless, he binds himself to renounce the same right on the payment of 9 lasts and 7 barrels of salmon, each barrel being reckoned at £10. So that ownership there of who owns the fishing rights, who'll be using them, and the payment to renounce that right is also being paid in salmon. So you get the fact that they have gone to the effort of creating this parchment document, going to the effort of writing it out. There are witnesses, there are 2 ministers and another person witnessing that legal document. So you can see that it is of huge legal significance to the estate to get the salmon fishing rights clear. And then there are numerous references relating to how the estates how the fishings were managed on the estates. And again, all of our estate collections have references to this. So in D538, which is our Munro of Navarre collection, so a different Munro family but linked, and again, this is a huge collection of documents, very strong on estate management particularly. And in that collection there are rent rolls which detail the tenants in each property, and they make explicit reference to the fishing rights and who is allowed to fish where when they're a tenant on the estate. There are also detailed accounts regarding the salmon fishing on the Navarre estates. They detail the cost of maintaining the infrastructure and equipment needed to catch salmon. So, for instance, I've gone to one of my all-time favourite websites, the Dictionary of the Scots Language, the DSL. Fantastic website. If you haven't looked at it, do have a look, to get some of the terminology that appears frequently throughout these documents. So the creeves, and again, I don't know if that's creeves or creeves, but those are the wicker salmon traps that are kept in rivers and tideways. There are frequent references to years, which is, DSL says, an enclosure generally built of stone or occasionally of wattle work in an estuary or a bay on a seashore to trap fish, especially salmon, in nets or by hand as the tide recedes. There's references to cobbles, which I've already said. So cobbles are small flat-bottomed rowing boats, mostly used in river or lake fishing or for salmon fishing by net near to the coast. There are references to stell fishing, which means to place nets across the river to catch the salmon, preventing the free run of the fish up the river. So that would be a net going across the river, so when the salmon try to leap up, they get caught in the net instead. So you see there a real range of ways that they're catching and the salmon. And an example of this can be seen in 1776 account from the Munro of Navarre collection, and that gives details of the outlays and the profits from the year and stell fishing on the estate of Muirton. So for instance, it references a £160 payment for repairs to the year, payments for servants for working on the year and on the cobble, repairing things, and also payments for the carriage of salmon. And it also shows the incomings. Sorry. So in that same year, 1776, we can find out that on that bit of Muirton fishing, £21, 1 shilling and 10.5 pence for cash, it was paid in cash for green fish, and £33 was gained for salted fish. And although I'm focusing specifically on salmon, there are references within this to mussel scalps, mussel beds, various other things as well. So you can see that it was a matter of real both legal importance and financial value to the estate. It was a vital and lucrative part of estate and land ownership. In our Bailey of Dunane collection, there's a letter written in January 1772 by John Aves to William Bailey in India. And in it, Aves refers to the recent death of William Bailey's father and the weak health of his mother, who's been suffering from a fever. But the purpose of Aves's letter to Bailey is to impress on him the need for him to send a power of attorney or a power of factory home, particularly with regards to the management of the estate. So he's lost his father. If he loses his mother as well, who is going to manage the estate of Dunane, and how is it to be managed if he's going to stay in India for much longer? But what I found striking was that one of the only business matters that he specifically refers to in this letter is the management of the salmon fishing. And he says, your salmon fishing at the Bona was begun 8 days ago, and they have taken already about 60 fish. If the Saturday's slap takes place, and you may insist upon it when you please, I'm persuaded that the fishing would turn out to a very good account. And turns out I did not just Google Saturday slap because I was a bit concerned of what might come up, but I did find it in the Dictionary of the Scots Language. And it was a period from Saturday night to Monday morning fixed by law for the free passage of fish up a river. And that comes from the word slap or slop, meaning a gap or an open space. So there's a gap in the week where the fish were allowed to jump up the river and that they couldn't be caught. We have loads of references to this within our collections and the legalities and the restrictions surrounding the fishing and the management of that. Some very detailed letters in Bailey, the collection, Bailey of Dunane collection, about the agreements between the town council, between the heritors, between all the people who had a say in that. So I mentioned there the town council, and there are also numerous records within our local government collections relating to the rights of fishing, who's allowed to fish where, who's allowed access to what bits of the river. And I spent an absolutely marvellous day yesterday at Hark in the Highland Archive Centre, going through boxes and boxes of these to talk about today. I've put a couple of pictures up on our Twitter and Instagram page. If you follow us, you'll see them there. But there are charters in there that grant permission for fishing, so much like that Fowles Charter. There are tacts where people have been given the management of the leasing of the fishing rights. There are receipts for money owed. There are letters talking about the sales of land and fishings with legal opinion attached to them. And there are petitions. So, for instance, there's a petition from 1874 written by the inhabitants of Inverness to the town council asking for clarification on what their fishing rights are and why they appear to have changed. And it is a huge document with absolutely dozens and dozens of signatures on it. And it says, we the undersigned, inhabitants of Inverness, respectfully request that you should cause inquiry to be made as to how the inhabitants have lost the right granted to them by Royal Charter of King James to all the fishings in the water of the Ness, from the sea to Clachnahary. Also as to what rights are still remaining to the inhabitants, and who are the parties entitled to interfere with the inhabitants while fishing within their boundaries. We would at the same time urge on the town council not to continue the present arrangement by which the inhabitants are allowed to fish only 1 day in 8, and to come instead to some arrangement by which the inhabitants can exercise their right of fishing more frequently and more conveniently. And it says that those who are fond of a few hours fishing after their hard and arduous daily occupation should be allowed to fish without being interrupted by the water bailiffs or the police. Which I thought was very, very interesting, that refers specifically to fishing really for pleasure. This is not fishing for survival. they're saying there that we do a hard and arduous long day, and we're fond of a few hours fishing. And there are loads of papers within the collection talking about this, again detailing who's allowed to fish where and why any previous rights had been lost. There have been times in Highland history where those rules have been actively overturned, and a very clear example of this can be seen in the Sutherland County Council minutes of May 1917, so of course towards the end of the First World War. And it has this paragraph in it. The convener, having referred to the present crisis in the food supply and to the urgent necessity of utilising to the best advantage the available food supply of the county, moved the following motion, which was seconded by Mr. John Ross and unanimously agreed to, namely that the Council, in response to the appeals of the Prime Minister and Lord Devonport, earnestly calls the attention of His Majesty's Government to the large supplies of wholesome food which could be obtained from the lochs, rivers and tidal waters of the county, and which are now largely allowed to go to waste in the interests of sport. It is a well-known fact that in many of the lochs and pools of the rivers there are at present moment large numbers of salmon which should be netted by the fishing tenant or landlord and put on the market. The Council most respectfully urges the removal of all restrictions whatsoever on trout fishing, on lochs and rivers, and that the fishing for salmon by rod and line on the tidal waters of rivers and on the sea estuaries should be thrown open to the inhabitants of the county for the production of food. So you can see there at times of crisis when they've gone, just scrap all of those rules, people need to eat, which is interesting. But of course there were numerous times that the rules were broken on other occasions. And our court papers, and no doubt our church collections, but I didn't look in them, are also full of stories to this effect. So for instance, 1753, Mr. Patrick Nicholson, Minister of Kiltarlity, appealed to Duncan Fraser of Achnacairn, Hugh Fraser of Dumballoch, and James Fraser of Reelig, all JPs, so all Justices of the Peace, and of course all landowners. And his petition says that whereas by the laudable laws and constitution of this realm all profaners and abusers of the Lord's day in any manner of way are punishable by the law, and ought to be chastised according to the degree of their offence, but delivering them and others from that or like offence in time coming. So he's saying, we've got this rule, we've got a law for anybody who abuses the Lord's day, so does something they shouldn't be doing on a Sunday, and they should be punished as an example to other people and themselves. He says, despite all of this, David McIntyre, alias Miller in Kiltarlity, and Hugh Ross Weaver in Fenelon, John Cameron and Rory Roy within the parish of Kilmorrock, have to the dishonour of God, the contempt of his holy laws, and the reproach of our holy religion, publicly and audaciously profaned the Sabbath by fishing salmon on the water of Bewley with their fishing clips out of different deep pots on each side of the river, and that upon the last Sabbath or Lord's Day, being the 8th inst, despite both civil and ecclesiastical laws and to the scandal of their profession as Christians, the offence of all serious persons and the bad example of others, they continued to fish. May it therefore please your honours to punish the above-named scandalous persons as the law directs. And they did indeed get arrested and get jailed. But don't feel too bad for them, because there's a letter from one day later after Hugh Ross's arrest for that, which says, written by a Robert Fraser in Merkinch, who wrote to the magistrates offering to pay the £10 fee because he doesn't want the poor fellow to languish in jail. There are huge numbers of references within our court collections to salmon fishing in a prohibited place. So for instance, an 1868 complaint against illegal fishing on the Ness, also a prohibited time, so for instance the Sabbath or just out of season. But the court papers also reveal that the salmon fishers were often involved in other sorts of trouble as well. So for instance in 1726, when they cut the ropes of a ship that was moored at South Keswick and set it adrift. Or the story of the salmon thefts from the Ness Islands, which kept me up until well after 1 a.m. last night. I sat with my partner, we tried to work out what our judgment was on this case. 24 pages of court papers. So I will definitely run over a little bit because I couldn't think how best to share this with you. So here goes. I'll try and summarise this dramatic story of salmon theft the best I can. It's a 24-page document in the court papers. It gives an overview of the events of the 3rd of August 1771, including witness statements, medical statements, and an arrest warrant. So this is my copy of the front page. Unto the Honourable Provost and Magistrates of Inverness, the petition and information of Duncan Grant, Writer and Procurator Fiscal of Court for the public interest. So he's saying, I'm coming to you because it's in the public interest that this case is investigated. That early of this morning, the body of Thomas Macpherson, residing in Drummond, parish of Dors, was passing with the river and was dragged in on the north side of the Ness upon the little green within the territory, dead. That there are various accounts of the cause and manner of the said defunct perishing, which gave occasion to the prospecting of the body by persons of character and knowledge. So they don't know why he's died, so they're concerned. They've pulled in people, reliable people to investigate. As it concerns the public and the individuals connected with the defunct, to have this investigated and inquired into, may it therefore please your honours to take statements from such gentlemen as the petitioner is ready to advance to find out what happened. So the body of Thomas Macpherson had been pulled out of the water and a medical examination was done. And the first statement that appears in this document is that of William Chisholm, who was the baillie and surgeon. And he says that he went with Dr. John Aves, the physician, and Robert Grant, the surgeon, to inspect the body that had been pulled out of the water. And they found grains of shot in the body, so like a cartridge, the small grains of shot within a larger cartridge. 4 grains of shot in his left thigh, and 3 grains in his left side, one of which had pierced the skin. They said that they opened the body and found that the shot had touched the stomach but had not broken it. They also found a contusion, so a bruise or a wound on the front of his head, which they also opened, but there was no shot found within that. They gave opinion that the grains of shot had not caused the death. There are then statements from all the other doctors who agree with this. I won't read you all 24 pages that I read last night to try and get a handle on it. One of the doctors then produced grains of shot as evidence as well. The next statement is by Hector Maclean. Hector Maclean was a day labourer and a Chelsea pensioner in Inverness. So Chelsea pensioners is just anybody with a military pension. The ones we think of with the red coats are the inn pensioners in Chelsea. He says that he was employed to watch the bleach field at the Bucht opposite the islands. Now I love this because those of you who know the Archive Centre will know that this is literally a stone's throw away from where the Archive Centre building is. We are just on the Bucht opposite the islands. And I will never go there again without thinking about this story. So Hector Maclean says that he was employed to watch the bleach fields, but about 10 o'clock at night he heard a great noise like the smashing or breaking of timber, and he thought that someone might be smashing up the boat belonging to Mr. Henderson on the north side of the river. He went to look, but he saw no one, so he returned back to his watch. At about 11 o'clock, Mr. Henderson, the boat owner, came up and said that he had been on the other side of the river and had also heard a great noise in the islands as if someone was felling timber. Henderson instructed Maclean to go to the town, which it describes as being nearly an English mile from the Bucht, and to gather the salmon fishers, because he believed that the noise was the salmon chests that were stored on the islands being smashed up and stolen. So Maclean went and fetched William Anderson, Benjamin McBain, Peter McQueen and Paul Fraser, who came up the north side, and then he saw Alex McCorkey, Donald McIntyre and Robert Tate go up the south side. He noticed that Robert Tate was holding a gun. He went back to his station, but before long he heard shouting and then 2 shots being fired before someone came towards him and said, "Has anybody run past here?" But no one had. There are statements within this from every one of those people I've mentioned. All of their own perspectives and viewpoints are given, some from the south bank of the river, some from the north bank, but all describing pretty much the same thing, which was that they were all called from bed. They went to join their comrade fishermen, so very much a feeling of that community. And they almost set an ambush. They set up two groups on either side of the river, blocking entrances to the islands. Those on the south and east side saw a man coming from the Meikle Island, so the bigger of the islands, where the salmon chests were kept. They saw that he was carrying a burden. And so this is what the statement says, that they listened opposite to the little island. They in a little discovered a man coming from the Meikle Island where the chests are, coming along by the carry or the water dyke, so that's like a weir, having a burden on him, and he stopped in the little island. They lay in wait to see if he would come to land where they were. But finding that he had no intention and was returning again to the Meikle Island, so he's obviously stopped, put something down, sneaking back onto the big island. The witness and those with him over and again called at the man to return and come to land, and that he would be met with forgiveness. That he refused to do so, notwithstanding, and running forward onto the carry, so onto the weir, with great speed towards the great island to escape them. Then the said Robert Tate, in order to alarm and stop his progress, fired 2 shots at him, after which the said man went on in his course and got under cover on the Meikle Island. So he ran, he continued to run. They fired 2 warning shots towards him, Robert Tate did. They also threw stones at him. It mentions in another witness statement that they shouted in both English and Gaelic to try and get through to him, but he ignored them. He ran back onto the big island and hid under cover. So they lost the man, and having lost him, they resolved to go to Inverness to get boats and to call others to help with the search, and they're quite sure there's a whole gang. They talk repeatedly about there's a group of men on the island. But they found no people on the island. But what they did find was 2 of the salmon chests smashed and salmon dropped on both the big island and the little island in a trail. But my favourite statement of them all, and there are many, is that of John Munro. This is the man who actually found the body. And he says that about 4 o'clock on the Saturday morning of the 3rd of August, John McCorkey, the immediate preceding witness, so the person who did the last statement, wakened the witness, who lives on the Green of Muirton, and told him to get up as quick as possible, for the whole of the fishers were about the islands, as there were thieves in the islands, and that one of them had been wounded. He accordingly got up and proceeded onto the west side of the river until he came to the foot of the waterworks there. So again, that weir, without meeting any person, so he hadn't met anyone by that point. He says, there he stopped and began to consider with himself whether he would go up by the waterworks to the island or whether he would go up by the riverside. I love that description, that he stopped to consider with himself. He then says that in a short time he had determined to go by the waterworks. He had not proceeded above a step or 2 into the water when he discovered a dead body just at the pool on the lower part of the waterworks, which made him retreat some steps backwards until he found the water turn deep, which made him form a circuit to pass the body, the sight of which had made him much frightened. And I think it's a really clear picture of him stumbling across this body, backing away from it, and then going into deep water and having to make a circuit round it without going close to it, but being frightened at the fact that he had found this body. He then goes on that he carried on towards the Meikle Island, where he was challenged by William Anderson and Benjamin McBain. They shouted at him from the land and said, who goes there? They asked who was there, and he answered, "It's me, John Munro." They said, if you go any further, you'll be a dead man, because there are thieves everywhere. And he said back to them, "Alas, there are already too many dead men. There is a man drowned." And they asked him where, and the witness took them to the foot of the carry. Anderson and McBain then returned to the foot of the carry by the land, as did the witness by the carry. So they went down the edge of the bank, he went down the weir to where they got to where the body lay. And then Samuel Ancram, who was the overseer of the fishers, and some others came from the town and lifted the body out of the water. Robert Tate was arrested, the man who had fired those 2 shots. He was arrested initially, but I don't know how long that lasted. We don't hold the Tolbooth warding book for that period. We hold the prison book for later, but not for them. And so I don't know how long that arrest stood, given that the doctors didn't put the death down to the shots, and also that the punishment for stealing was very severe at that point. And I would imagine there would likely be sympathy with the fact that Robert Tate had been trying to defend the salmon stock. So I don't know what happened. My own feeling is that he ran. He had been shot. He'd had these stones thrown at him. He ran along the top of the weir and lost his footing and fell and hit his head. That's my own take, but tell me what you think. And I'm hoping Margaret Kirk's going to catch up on this, one of our local crime writers, and write a story about it. So yes, as I've said several times before, one of the frustrations of working with archives is you get parts of these stories and then you don't get all of them. But it delights me to get any part of them. So you can see there again the huge importance and value placed on the fishing industry by these people. They have gone out risking their lives to protect the stock and gone out as a community as well. And then of course, coming into the 20th and the 21st century, salmon fishing and farming continue to play an important role here. In our Skye and Loch Alsh Archive Centre, we hold the papers of the West Highland Salmon Fisheries Company. In 1944, James Banks and Sons of Perth took over the lease for the sea salmon fishings on the Kilmuir estate in Skye from Powrie and Sons. They created a separate company called West Highland Salmon Fisheries to operate that lease, both James Banks and his wife Jane and also their son David. And they held that lease until 1962, when the company was taken over by Kenneth Matheson of Portree. And the collection that we hold in Skye gives a really detailed insight into salmon fishing as a larger scale business. There are cash books, there are wages, correspondence, both correspondence from employees, from customers, from agents. There are reports and plans and inventories and patterns for making salmon nets and maps showing where their fishing stations were, because when they took over, there were fishing stations at Lealt, at Rig, at Staffin, Portree, and various other places across Skye and Raasay. They mostly had 4-man crews, so the company employed around 28 men each year, and the season ran from late spring into the beginning of autumn, but some men continued to be employed through the winter to take down ice to store in the ice houses, because that was where the fish were stored prior to being transferred to Kyle of Loch Alsh, and then on to individual private homes, to businesses, and to markets in Birmingham and Billingsgate in London and so on. And we hold a huge amount of information about that as well. We hold information about the contracts, the hours, the equipment, such as oilskins and rubber boots and so on that were issued, and details of the catch as well. And really interesting that the catch averaged around 3,000 fish in the 1940s and 50s, which is not that dissimilar from that 1798 catch. Really, all of those later records are just a more recent version of the documents we've already looked at. They talk about who has the right to fish where, upkeep and maintenance of boats and equipment and nets, the cost of carriage. So we saw that in that early Munro of Navarre document, the cost of getting the salmon away, and the number of fish and the price got for them. So although in some respects that industry has changed massively, in some respects it really hasn't. And now of course we have a substantial salmon farming industry in Scotland as well, one of the top producing countries in the world, and predominantly based on the west coast, where salmon are bred and hatched and grown in tanks and then in water cages in the water. There are over 20 of those in Skye alone, and it is an industry, salmon farming, which has both supporters and detractors, but certainly what it is another part of the story in the Highlands' relationship with salmon and salmon fishing. I hope you have enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed researching it. I really did. I found all sorts of interesting stories as I was doing it, so I hope you have enjoyed that. thank you for joining me. I'm very conscious I've run over a wee bit. I hope you can join me next week. Next week we will move on to crime and punishment. Nice link in with Salmon, apparently. We're starting next week by looking at references to witchcraft across our collections. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, we are very, very grateful for that. Thank you.